Should we get started? Wonderful. Well, welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Colleen Callahan, and I'm Deputy Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. We're a policy-oriented research center. We analyze proposed and existing environmental policies for their effectiveness, equity impacts, and innovation. And then we hope to get the research used by leaders like the ones you see here, environmental leaders, policymakers to help inform evidence-based environmental policy. We're about 9 years old, so we didn't exist when California's cap-and-trade program was designed and adopted. But since then, we have been involved in helping the state evaluate investments made from cap-and-trade revenue via California climate investments, with a focus on trying to maximize benefits for disadvantaged communities most impacted by pollution and poverty. So I want to come back to that point later because this session will explore kind of process, program, as well as the revenue investments and their design, because all three are important. So it's no secret that there are opponents to market mechanisms to address climate change. And what is less well known, though, is some of the nuanced thinking behind some of these oppositions and these concerns. Today we have a panel of tribal and environmental justice leaders who are going to give you their experiences, tell you about their experiences, share their perspectives, their concerns with market mechanisms. And we're going to have a focus on California, given that's where we live, that's what we know best. We're in California today. And of course, California is well known for kind of setting precedent when it comes to environmental and specifically climate policy. And this can impact other kind of efforts around the world. So we will have that California focus. And now I'm going to introduce our three illustrious panelists. Starting with Xavier Kinney, who is a Yurok tribal citizen, and he is executive director of this tribe, the Yurok tribe. His policy and governance work involves issues of climate change, natural resource management, economic development, and more. And then next to him is Ramirez, who is policy director of Pacoima Beautiful, a grassroots environmental justice organization that promotes education, impacts public policy, and supports local arts and culture in order to promote a healthy and sustainable San Fernando Valley here in the LA region. And then closest to me is Joseph, AKA Joe Lyou. He is president and CEO of the Coalition for Clean Air, a statewide organization that is dedicated to protecting public health, improving air quality, and preventing climate change. From 2007 to literally last month, he served as the governor's appointee to the South Coast Air Quality Management District.
Governing board.
Yes.
It's a lot of words. That's okay.
Governing board of the South Coast AQMD. So panelists, I'm going to start with a question, and Joe, you can kick it off, and then we'll go down. The other two of you can answer. It's a general question, so tell us what you and your organization or tribe feel are critical considerations in carbon markets, and how do you seek to get these considerations addressed? Like I said, we'll start with Joe, maybe to give a historical perspective given your long involvement.
I mean, it's a little bit less of the official position of Coalition for Clean Air, but my own personal history. I've been at Coalition for Clean Air for about 8.5 years, but a lot of this happened way before then. And I was very much involved in that. And could I just kind of do a quick survey of the folks who are here? I know it's late Friday afternoon in downtown Los Angeles, and you guys are crazy to get stuck in the traffic. We kind of are obligated to be up here. How many people are from California? Okay, a good many of you. So you kind of know what's going on here with the cap and trade program. And how many of you are here because you too have questions about the equity market? Huh? No? A few. How many of you make your living on an equity market and had needed a place to focus your anger today? Okay. Anyway, so I was involved in a lot of environmental justice policy efforts back in starting around 2000 to 2003 when the California Air Resources Board, then Cal EPA started really paying attention to environmental justice issues, and this was a time in which we had to kind of educate everybody about even what environmental justice was all about. And there were discussions when Fran Pavley and started moving AB 32 about what that might look like. And there was a big debate over whether the bill itself would include the word may or shall when it came to cap and trade program. And there was a lot of negotiation over that, quite honestly. And it ended up being may, even though everyone kind of understood it, that the governor at that point, Arnold Schwarzenegger, interpreted it as shall. And we were focusing on a lot of other issues in addition to this question of cap and trade programs at the time when it came to environmental justice, like permitting and enforcement and regulations and public participation, land use, and of course, cumulative environmental impacts, which is one of the more difficult policy issues to deal with. And we ended up doing an advisory group process, the Cal EPA Environmental Justice Advisory Group. It was a 2-year process in which we had a very diverse stakeholder group of 17 members who developed recommendations. We could not agree on precautionary principle issues, and we could not agree on cumulative environmental impacts. And it was before trading became a real issue, because that was done in 2003.
Do you want to define what precautionary principle and cumulative impacts mean
Precautionary
to you?
principle is basically making a decision and erring on the side of protecting public health as opposed to putting the burden of proof on those people who are trying to protect themselves. I'll summarize it that way. Making precautionary decisions, making decisions in a way that errs on the side of caution. And with cumulative environmental impacts, it's the idea of all this environmental justice stuff that is wrapped up in it, that there are communities that are overburdened relative to others when it comes to environmental issues. A lot of that has to do with air quality, which is why I ended up doing a lot of air quality work. And that began a process, and then at the end of this process where we had a change from Gray Davis being recalled and Arnold Schwarzenegger being put into office, then the whole climate issue started coming up. And of course, on the grand scale, the concerns are that we are going to worsen the impacts in these environmental justice communities that already have a disproportionate burden of pollution through these cap and trade programs, which allow for people to trade pollutants into a community. The other possibility, of course, is that we create environmental justice problems where they don't already exist. And of course, that there's a possibility that those environmental justice communities don't benefit from the benefits of market mechanisms where they may have otherwise benefited from them. And then there's a whole other thing that happened, and that was really one of prioritization. And the question, and I think a lot of people at the Air Resources Board, including Mary Nichols, would admit that, especially right after AB 32 was passed, the prioritization became all about greenhouse gases. And there was the attention that had been being paid to environmental justice issues lost a lot of momentum. And so there's a whole bunch of things that are wrapped up in that. Let me see, what did I forget? If I haven't been clear, environmental justice advocates do not like trading programs. They prefer the adoption and enforcement of regulations when there's a choice. They also like polluter pay schemes, but ones that are more direct, like in carbon fees or taxes. And then there's a whole bunch of other issues. Of course, I spent almost 12 years at South Coast Air Quality Management District Governing Board, and we have a trading program there, the Reclaim Trading Program for criteria pollutant credits, and you learn some lessons in that. And the lesson with Reclaim was that there were a lot of problems, and it became very political, and it wasn't functioning as well as it should be. And it was also getting to the point where it wasn't necessary anymore, because the requirement was get to the level, cut the cap down, shave the cap down to a level in which you would have an equal amount of air pollution as the best available retrofit control technology would take you and allow the participants in the market to figure that out. But it became so political that that shave was really a very political decision and one in which did not go well. And then there was some pushback. And then there was a decision to just try to do away with the program. And the agency has spent the last 2 years trying to figure out how you actually do that. And for those of you over 50, we call that the Hotel California scenario, where you can check in and cannot check out. For those of you under 50, you can call it maybe the zombie scenario, where once you've got these trading programs, that they're hard to kill off, if not impossible. So and AQMD's going through that right now. It's really, really difficult to kind of undo that once you've stepped into it. I think I've probably gone on long enough. I'm not sure if I answered all your questions, but I've raised several of the issues I intended to. I can go on forever, but obviously we want to hear from everyone else.
Okay. So Andres, what is Pacoima Beautiful's role in, or perspective on market mechanisms, particularly California's cap and trade program as a case study? And are you involved in addressing any of kind of the concerns that your organization may have?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we're more involved on the ground level at the EJ communities, right? And seeing, you know, what we're seeing is the resources that are generated through cap and trade are not really reaching the EJ communities that are supposed to be prioritized. The thought being that because EJ communities bear the burden, the highest burden, health burden, economic burden of fossil fuel usage, these communities should be prioritized with these greenhouse gas reduction programs. But what we're finding is, through the bureaucracy of the state, the communities that are highest need tend not to be competitive for a lot of these resources. Communities like Pacoima, rural communities like in the Central Valley, up north in Oakland and whatnot, right? We find that the resources ultimately don't reach the highest needed communities, right? And the other piece that we realize as well is this conversation around, GGRF or climate change isn't a siloed issue in EJ communities. There's other impacts that occur when investment comes into a community, because then it raises the concern of housing and jobs, right? Are jobs being generated? Are those jobs being generated locally? Or are those jobs being contracted outside of the community and the economic benefit are not reaching those communities, right? Because a lot of the impact when we're talking about equity, and just the language of equity, I think is something that we're finding is becoming challenging because it's the sexy word that's used in policy circles. Everybody loves using the language of equity. I don't think everybody means it in the same manner, right? Folks throw the word equity and are talking about let's slice up the pie evenly to everybody. And our perspective is, well, true equity, you got to take in perspective historic practices of distribution of wealth in this state and region. And certain communities have been prioritized for decades, right? And our communities have not. And if we're trying to reach true equity, then we got to flip that balance, right? And that means the highest burden communities should get prioritized, should get the biggest slice of the pie. And that's the battle we find ourselves in quite often, right? That's where we find our highest level of advocacy. There are efforts to try to address these issues. I know we sit on a disadvantaged community advisory group that the PUC and the CEC have created to find ways to really address the access piece of cap and trade resources. Because programs are created, but the state's finding that they're not reaching the communities that are being targeted. And a lot of it has to do with just the need for technical assistance. Because Pacoima is a little different because we are part of the city of Los Angeles, so we do have the cities. We got to organize the city to make sure that they're advocating on our behalf. But smaller municipalities tend not to have the resources in terms of staff or otherwise to be able to, compete for these resources. And I think that's something that we feel is important that needs to be addressed. And then the other piece as well is how local residents or community members on the local level are participating in the decision making in terms of where resources are being distributed. A lot of decisions are happening from the top, and by the time they reach down to the ground level, it's just been all watered down, right? The intention of the policies tend not to be seen. And I think that disconnect is an important, that bridging that disconnect is an important piece of, really addressing the need of those carbon markets, right? Because what we're seeing also is the burden on our air quality is not lowering in these communities. And that's a problem as well, right? And we feel that, and that's what we're trying to address when we applied for the Transformative Climate Communities proposal through SGC, is creating a model that's community oriented and partnering both with government and business to create a solution locally, right? And we feel that model is something that can be successful in really gaining the goals of addressing the climate impacts in these communities, but also really transforming the economic, and the intersectionality of these issues, right? Because like I said, it's not just an environmental justice issue. It tends to also include transportation, housing, and jobs. And that's something that we feel we have to broaden our perspective when it comes to this conversation of carbon markets.
Mm-hmm. Yes, congratulations on being part of one of the winning grants to receive a Transformative Climate Communities kind of initiative in your community. The program that he's referring to, Transformative Climate Communities, I think is the most comprehensive, the most innovative community scale experiment in climate action that I'm aware of. And it seeks to de-silo the way that climate investments have thus far worked in California, where if a community wants, say, bike lanes and more transit, they go to 2 different agencies. If they want to invest in urban greening, they go to another. Energy efficiency, they go to another. And so this program tries to bring together under kind of one umbrella and through one agency a number of different ways that communities can take climate action. And it does through large grants that can then be leveraged for even more funding. So it makes it, but it's not necessarily, even though there's fewer agencies, it's still an extremely complex process to go through. And so some of those technical kind of capacity issues are still very much there. So just wanted to provide a little bit more background. But yes, congrats again on that grant. Javier, tell us about your tribe and your experience with cap and trade.
Yes, thank you, Colleen. Again, my name is Xavier Kinney, tribal citizen of the Yurok tribe in Northern California. Our ancestral lands are both in Humboldt and Del Norte counties. But we also want to show our respect for the ancestral territory that we are here in Los Angeles as well, and the surrounding area, the Tongva people as well. And I want to cover 3 things again throughout the time that we have on this panel. Is one, the recognition as well as inclusion of indigenous peoples, not only in the carbon markets, but the decision-making authorities, both domestically here in the state of California, United States, and internationally. Second, the expression of the inherent sovereignty of tribal leaders as well as indigenous knowledges in these climate change resiliency, as well as combating the effects of various actors and behaviors that indigenous peoples worldwide are not only monitoring, but attempting to address and resolve. And third, and most importantly, the cultural relevance and exchange in regards to having indigenous peoples at the decision-making table, speaking for themselves, as well as receiving the finance opportunities directly, rather than going through third parties or other nonprofit organizations that seem to purport to speak for indigenous peoples worldwide. So let me take the first one. In the primary objective for the Yurok tribe in engaging in the carbon market is indigenous peoples, or the 110 federally recognized tribes in California, were not included. And so let me say that again. The Yurok tribe literally kicked down the door in regards to the policymakers in being included in this finance market aspect. Now, we did that for a couple reasons. Number one, being the largest tribe in California, but also one of the most economically disadvantaged communities in the state for various reasons. And I want to sort of address this vulnerable, targeted aspect. So the state of California, as well as corporations, as well as other landholders, have been able to provide the opportunity to try to displace that power of indigenous peoples in the state. But we're working together with not only the state of California, but other coalitions to make sure that those processes and that there's progress happening in regards to keeping indigenous peoples at the decision-making table. So when there's an exclusionary history, not only in the wealth of the state, but in the policies and the infrastructure, we want to make sure and address that, because we have to address it to resolve it. And if we keep sweeping it under the rug, it doesn't get talked about. The water coming into Los Angeles. Talk to the Paiutes of the Owens Valley in regards to how the creation of Los Angeles began. And that's just one example here. So we're trying to disrupt that consciousness purposefully. And I'm glad that we've been able to be included in the conference like this and other spaces that we may not agree, whether it's environmental justice organizations, the governor, agency representatives, but at least we're having that discussion of solutions. Because in many ways, I agree with our panelists, indigenous communities within the state of California, in Hawaii, in Alaska, in Massachusetts, in Florida, are feeling that brunt of climate. That's not part of our actions. So we have to come together in regards to, this is only one aspect of a diversified portfolio that the Yurok tribe is putting together. You want to talk to us about forest management, fisheries, water policy, fire, all of these aspects of what we have as indigenous knowledges. And fortunately, I'm honored to have my son here, Xavier Kinney, who's the first year at UCLA, that's going to be creating that next generation of leadership. But in addition to the leadership, we also have to have the technologies to go along with that. Because if we're not in the system, we've said we're going to work on the inside out. So this is not just our only opportunity. So we support our brothers and sisters, the other 7 tribes that are in the cap and trade market, but we also respect the opposition as well of the commodification or perceived commodifications of natural resources. So in regards to the inherent sovereignty of tribes, to be able to be the decision maker of our own self-determination is a nationhood discussion. So we're about 90% grant funded, about 10% income generation. We precede the United States government and we precede the state of California. So our tribal leadership is in the position now saying we want to be 90% income generation and 10% grant funding. Because as Yurok people and as Yurok communities, we're a self-sustaining tribe. We understand the subsistence as well as the ability to barter and trade with indigenous nations throughout the Western Hemisphere. And if you see those types of marketplaces, that's nothing new to us. We understand that Richmond, Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco have these air quality issues. But when you look at the land-based obligations and stewardship that tribes have, we also have to have that discussion as well, and how are we moving that needle? So the inherent sovereignty and the expression of that, right or wrong, is up to the tribal leadership and the tribal communities and indigenous peoples here in California, in the United States, and nationwide as well as internationally. So this past summer, we had approximately 20 countries visit the Yurok Reservation, leading up to the Climate Summit Action event that happened in San Francisco. What were we able to do? Again, we're not telling other tribes to get in the carbon market. We are providing our experience to Brazil, to Colombia, to Panama, to Venezuela. And you look at these individuals as well as communities and the political, economic, social, and legal aspects that they're going through right now, we were there 200 years ago. So again, we're providing that experience, and what that turned into, in 2021, we're going to be removing 4 dams, 2 in Oregon, 2 in California. And if you look at the collective natural resources management approach that we have, we're disrupting those institutional wealth holdings And people do not like that. But we're also reaching out to adverse parties, agriculture, other landowners, Green Diamond Timber Company, these other forest land managers and landowners. We're part of a California Forest Carbon Coalition, which we're able to, again, hopefully exponentially affect the decision-making ways that land is managed at the governmental levels, at the private levels, but looking forward to that conservation objective. And last and final, I guess, to answer your question as well, is the cultural exchange and management of how people interact. Again, the songs, the prayers, the ceremonies that we're still carrying on today is prayer for everybody. It's not just for Yurok people. Those world renewal ceremonies that we carry on that needs the fresh flow of water, that needs the fresh flow of air, is for everybody. And so when these, including the Yurok and other indigenous activities and cultural knowledges are shared, some are also kept private for specific reasons. And we appreciate that respect to have that. But we have youth, again, mentioning the cultural exchange with my son. We're monitoring it. How's it affecting beaches in Hawaii? How are the glaciers being melted in Alaska or in Antarctica? How is Brazil treating their Amazon rivers as well as the indigenous knowledges being able to be institutionalized? It's not all unicorns and rainbows, and we understand that. We've been able to engage and be effective in that space, and we look forward to continuing that. And again, what we do works for Yurok, and we're hopefully will be able to share that experience with others and work exponentially. We're less than 1% in the state California's population, right? And I think we're talking about other 1%, whether it's wealth, which is going to transfer by 2050. You could talk to the elders or those institutional sort of extractive industry giants. But what are their kids and grandkids doing? And so for the generational work that we're doing, we're hopefully making those solutions available to everybody.
Mm-hmm. And I know you speak on national stages about your experience with the carbon market in California. What are some kind of lessons, or what do you tell kind of other entities around the world that are interested in your experience and kind of how to learn from it?
In 2012, the Yurok Tribal Council passed a resolution supporting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Before the United States, before New Zealand, before Australia, that respect goes a long ways. And I think it's not until indigenous rights and responsibilities are acknowledged that everybody else or everybody's actions will take place in a conforming way. Mm-hmm. Again, we were invited to Oslo, Norway, at a tropical summit. Went to Brazil, Acre, Macapá. Again, next week there's going to be indigenous leaders in Colombia. There's a proclamation that the governor's task force lined out of how indigenous people should be interacted with. Not only a consultation. We appreciate people talking to us, but when you hear us and not do anything about it, or it's an inactive sort of communication style, it doesn't work for us. We come from that protest, that direct action, that frontline work. That's how we secured our senior water rights. That's how we secured our religious freedom. That's something we're used to. But we're looking at the adverse relationships, again, with the state of California. That's the times of the past. You have two governors that recognize that. You have agency representatives that recognize that. So I would encourage them to take a look at that UN declaration, take a look at these declarations and proclamations. Because in Brazil, you should not be killed or violently hurt because you're sticking up for your land and your rights and resources. And this platform's right here, and again, our colleagues expressed that. And we're looking forward to continuing that support and solidarity in whichever way that is. Now, people may not agree with our carbon market inclusion or participation, which is fine with us, because we've got to go home and make sure that that exponential experience is not only relayed, but shared in a way that makes exponential change.
Thank you. I want to come back to the topic of cumulative impacts and specifically air quality and kind of the number of type of pollutants that we're concerned about in environmental justice communities disproportionately impacted. So a couple years ago, when California's cap and trade program was the reauthorization of it was being debated, something that came out of the negotiations was an air quality bill. I might be mischaracterizing it slightly, so Joe, correct me on kind of how your experience was with the debate. But ultimately, we now have a bill, AB 1617, that is
617.
617, excuse me, that is seeking to address the air quality concerns that obviously weren't part of the design of cap and trade, which is focused on carbon, GHGs, and not necessarily on cumulative air quality impacts.
Yeah.
Tell us, we're early days in implementing 617, but tell us, do you think this could be a promising model for how to kind of couple and address air quality concerns?
There's that possibility. And I try to remain hopeful, but there's a lot of skepticism among some about it. And it's important to understand how we ended up with AB 617 by Cristina Garcia because of the fact that politics play into everything. We were not going to get the extension of the cap and trade program if there weren't concessions made to the legislators who, representing their communities, said, you need to do something about the air pollution in my community, in my district. And they stood up and they would have blocked the companion bill from getting through that allowed for the extension of the cap and trade program through 2030. So AB 617 became sort of the throw in everything you want and had never been able to get legislation of the year. And so there's a lot of different parts to it. There is an air quality monitoring part. There is the funding of community projects part. There is the development of a emission reduction plan part. There is an increase in the penalties for violating air quality pollutant laws and regulations part. So there's a lot going on with AB 617. But a lot of people at first focused really on the air quality monitoring part because it ended up in just the way the law was written, that section came first. And people kind of focused on that and forgot about the other parts. That's not necessarily the most important part, but it's an important part. It's also a requirement to update the inventory data. We, across California, it's kind of difficult to address air quality problems if you don't have good inventory data. And the inventory data is sort of haphazard when you look collectively across all the different local air districts and ARB's inventory collectively. So we're trying to fix that. But it's the emission reduction section of AB 617 that holds the most promise. And that is requiring for the priority communities, a handful of which have been selected now, the development of emission reduction plans this year. More communities will be selected next year. And those emission reduction plans are supposed to identify the problems, identify what to do about them, and identify a plan on going forward. It's too early to judge, really, whether they're going to be successful or not, because a lot of the pollutants in a lot of these communities are not under the control of either the local air district, the California Air Resources, or even EPA. Some of the things like ship emissions that impact a lot of communities, especially down here at our ports, where more than 40% of all the goods that come into the United States come through the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles here in San Pedro Bay. And those ship emissions are regulated internationally. Airplane emissions are regulated internationally. So some of those, if that is the problem, and that's where the emission reductions have to come, it can take decades to get to them. And so I'm trying to be hopeful, trying to engage. I've got Christopher Chavez from my staff right here in the second row. He's on one of the advisory groups for the port area, West Long Beach area, representative on there. He's going to those meetings and trying to make sure that that emission reduction plan gets developed in a way that's going to have an impact.
Okay, thank you. want to explore the revenue side a little bit further. So picking up on what you, Andres, were saying earlier about the revenues not getting to all the communities that need it, the ones that have kind of historically been underinvested in. How do we fix that? And what mechanisms would you like to see in place to help make sure that more investments are kind of tangible to these communities that need it the most? And the same question for you as well, Javier.
I mean, one solution we feel strongly about is room for innovation. I think one thing that we recognize is when policies are created in Sacramento, it's kind of approaching the problem in a cookie cutter kind of form for the rest of the state. And I think it's not taking into account the sheer diversity of the state, right? The issues that are happening in urban, centers are not the same as rural areas. Mm-hmm. And the solutions shouldn't be trying to be applicable to both. And I think being open to this idea of let's approach the problem regionally, right? How are we addressing the problem for the folks living up, where the Yuroks are at, right? And how is that different to how we're approaching it in urban centers like the Bay Area, Los Angeles, mm-hmm. right? How is it approaching, desert communities like Imperial Valley? We have to be open to this type of innovation, right? And I think at the same time, there is something to say the state can provide or provide as part of these resources the technical assistance needed for that innovation to really be birthed locally, right? Having that technical assistance of people who can help nurture the proposals or whatever it needs to occur to garner these resources, but that can be tied together to locally created plans, right? That's the approach that we try to do when it comes to addressing climate change. We work directly with community members who are in these communities we feel have the expertise on the needs and solutions that we need to address, and find ways to support those visions, right? I think that process is something that it's challenging. I'm not naive enough to say there's an easy solution, but what we do find is a lot of times, as well-intentioned as folks may be, decision makers may be when creating policies, they're disconnected to the realities happening on the ground, right? And I think that, like I said, that bridge needs to occur. And then, like I said, right, is being open to multiple strategies for addressing, climate change in these communities, because they're being affected in different manners, right? For some communities, it's more about water access, right? For other communities, it's about emissions and power plants or ports, right? And it takes different strategies to address those different issues, right? You can't just be, we're gonna tax the emissions so you could create programs around bike lanes, because maybe bike lanes is not a solution, is not an issue in that community, or not the priority, right? Maybe the issue more is the fact that this community doesn't have infrastructure for crosswalks, or doesn't have infrastructure for even to keep up with the housing market, or doesn't have housing, period, right?
Yeah. And our climate investments are, they're investing, the state is investing in a wide suite of types of climate action programs, but do you think that they're too prescriptive and there should be actually more flexibility, similar to the TCC, but even that is quite prescriptive in terms of giving communities more ability to define what they want to do in terms of climate action?
Definitely, because I think that was the critique that we had even with the TCC process, right? The onus was on bringing forth project-ready, on-the-ground project-ready, solutions. And these communities that have the highest need don't have projects that are shovel-ready, right? That investment hasn't occurred for several years. You can't have the expectation that for them to be competitive and have these ideas that have already capital that's backing them is unrealistic.
Let me interrupt and say, in Pacoima, when you're fighting over trying to get sidewalks in on your streets, you're not going to have transit-oriented development, shovel-ready projects
Right.
that are ready to go and get the funding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, and I think that reality is something that sometimes we have to advocate to ensure that folks understand, right? And we're cognizant of this, right? And I think it's important that realization be addressed in the policy language, because I think the challenge is the policymakers want to make things fit. It's almost like fitting a round peg in a square hole, right? Like they're used to working with this round peg, but the problems are in a square hole, right? And you got to fix it to make it fit, right? And I think that's part of the challenges that we have to address with this.
Well, from our perspective, I think old is new again. There's a lot of, again, I come back to this traditional knowledge and the indigenous worldview, as well as perspective and experience. It's easy to, again, take the quick fix, talk about riches rather than wealth. And I think once you start looking at digging deeper, and I'm sort of gonna take it to that next level as well, is again, reconforming that consciousness of how we approach the world we live in today. And I think one of the areas, whether it's private foundations, whether it's private sector, whether it's governmental work, we've really got to reevaluate what that wealth means to us as love, understanding, and trust, right? We have attorneys drafting documents, we have policymakers making decisions, and we have funders financing that institutional wealth. That's what we're disrupting. And again, land ownership in California. Who owns the land and how did they own it? Our direct ancestral tie to a particular place is what assists us in how we're gonna generate that next generational type of work. If we take today, knowing that we're not gonna have tomorrow, is something that is not culturally relevant to us. If it's something is not sustainable and we're taking action today that we're knowing generations down the line aren't gonna be able to sustain that, that's on us, right? But we don't just control that little piece of the Klamath River. We have to make sure and manage for the watersheds. So the jurisdictional analysis should get thrown out the window as well. People are always gonna want power and have power. But again, we're in the business of objectifying and saying, hey, this is not working anymore. And when you have millennials or you have these children that's gonna be inheriting and benefiting from that wealth that's not doing anything different, then again, that's on us too. And so that's why I think when you talk in revenue or you're talking sort of sharing this wealth, we've really got to talk to who's financing the foundations, what private sector revenues are going where, who are we selling to, and are they really making and committed to have that frame of mind and mindset of going in that direction. And I think we need to do that again locally and culturally. So there's a void there. I think that people, again, are looking towards these indigenous communities, these indigenous practices, these indigenous management. Fighting fire with fire. We've used fire traditionally to make sure that fuels reduction worked so that these massive wildland fires don't occur. And now you're having federal agencies, state agencies, again, sort of these policy thinkers saying, okay, hey, we've got this new technology. And we're saying, hey, wait, you know what? We've been trying to advise you of this for years. And it's positive, again, synergy going that direction. And again, that's why whether it's coalitions, whether it's people or individuals, and we've appreciated those discussions here of reaching out, professors, academia, writing about it, right? So we look forward to looking at not only case studies, documentation, biological opinions, peer-reviewed. We have probably one of the highest staff of biologists, second to the state of California. And there's a reason for that. And we appreciate that scientific contribution of, again, indigenous knowledges, of finding resolution and solutions rather than just raising the problem.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate the systems thinking and how everything's connected. I think it relates to kind of our conversation earlier about, you know, if we just think in kind of silos and, you know, air quality separated from GHGs, you're going to have some consequences of that. So making some broad parallels, but appreciate the systems thinking, systems thinkers we have on this panel. Want to leave some time. I believe we have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So we have a microphone here and would love to open up the conversation, get your questions for the panel. Yeah, we can hear you.
Barely see you.
Yeah, thank you for providing a little bit more background. We did throw out some acronyms, and just to be clear, when we say California Climate Investments, those are coming from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is funded, the revenue is coming from the state's carbon cap and trade program. And within the GGRF, we now have $9 billion, over $9 billion that's been appropriated. Not all of that has been spent, but to a number of really, I think it's 20 different programs. And those cross many different kind of sectors that I was mentioning, from transportation to energy to urban greening. And one of those programs is a Transformative Climate Communities program. So it's actually funded by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And I believe the question is, kind of what's this kind of, is there a structural problem with how the revenue is distributed? Is it kind of a matter of where it's going, or is more the issue at the agency level in terms of maybe not always getting it to where it needs to go in a way that the community really needs it to do?
I would jump in and say there's a few things going on there. First, was when the whole idea of generating these revenues and how they would be spent came around, there was still an ongoing and big debate on whether there should be a cap and trade program in California. And there were a lot of environmental advocates who were very much opposed to the idea. And they were actively opposing it and even filing a lawsuit to try to prevent it. At the same time, the organization that I came to work for had initiated the idea of dedicating a certain amount, a floor, a minimum amount, to the impacted communities that these advocates represented. And there was there was an awkward period, quite honestly, with Coalition for Clean Air and the environmental justice advocates, in which just by proposing the idea that there would be a certain amount of funding dedicated to these communities, that it undermined the efforts to actually oppose the cap and trade program in total. In the end, I thought it was pretty apparent that it was going to be tough, if not just impossible, to stop the cap and trade program from moving forward and those billions of dollars being generated. But once they were, it was important that that legislation was in place, and it was legislation that was authored by Kevin DeLeon and sponsored by Coalition for Clean Air and a lot of other, a big coalition of groups that was generated to support it. And then it came around and they increased the number in terms of the percentage that we dedicated to it. And the investment of the money has done really well in terms of targeting impacted communities, in all honesty. And the agencies and the people who are involved in making these decisions are cognizant of needing to invest in the most disadvantaged communities, of trying to get benefits that are not only climate benefits, but also air quality, air toxic benefits, jobs, land use, transportation, and a whole bunch of other things, quality of life issues in these communities. So that's not necessarily the problem. I think where the problems come in is when, through either trading programs or offset programs, you have facilities like power plants and refineries, and they get let out of the programs, like the refineries did, or other things in which the emissions can actually go up while you have this program going on in those communities. And when the offset programs allow that to happen, or the trading programs allow that to happen, that's problematic. There is a rather simple policy fix to it. No one really takes me seriously when I say it, but the idea is very simple, that you can trade pollutants out of those communities, but not into them. You can offset pollutants in those communities, but not get credit for offsets outside of those communities. And no one takes it seriously, but from a policy standpoint, it's a pretty simple fix.
Right. One thing I would add, I think the other unintended consequence of these investments that we find, right, has when if the infrastructure investment does come to these low-income communities, it has led to displacement and gentrification of these communities for the impacted, residents. As investments coming to infrastructure, it raises the property, the housing market value of that community. All of a sudden, people are being priced out, because that's the reason when we're talking about this need for this to be multifaceted and not siloed, because the jobs market is not keeping up with the housing rates, right? And this is speaking solely here in Los Angeles, right? But I know it does occur in other parts of the state. The impacted communities are actually being phased out of those communities, and that's problematic. And I think it wasn't the intention of this investment, right? The intention of the investment was to really address the impacts of fossil fuel usage on these communities, right? But as the resources have come, these are the results that we're starting to see, and the issues that we have to address.
Well, I think also, and just more of a step back, in addition, not only the carbon market, but I guess the future and the generational leaders that are going to be coming up with these types of market-based approaches. And I'm not sure if it's in business school, whether it's at Anderson or Haas or Stanford or Tuck, but being able to create financial leaders and CEOs that have social injustice programming within the balance sheet. So it's not we make our revenue and rate of return analysis, and then we do a charitable contribution. I think if we shift that obligation and that burden within the balance sheet itself, I think we may be able to come out on a trend in regards. Again, we're not going to fix it overnight, but what we're trying to do at the Yurok tribe is include these visionaries, sort of next generation thinkers of technology, but also how we're going to be setting up our finances worldwide. Because if you look at it, right, whether it's the attorneys or MBAs or policymakers or biologists, technicians, we've got to include that analysis within our work product.
This question is mostly for Javier, but if anyone else has knowledge of it, feel free to weigh in. I was just curious about the status of the tropical forest standard, and if you've gotten any updates from the new governor on what his administration intends to do, and also if you could just talk about some of the problems that your tribe and other tribes in California see with it. And then, sorry, a third part of the question is, I know some tribes in some places are actually in favor of it, so there's been a little bit of a split on that issue. So if you could talk about that as well.
No, wonderful question. And again, we did have a tribal representative in support of that at the hearing. We also, again, look at how we're able to engage the policymakers, the agency representatives, as well as the financial capabilities. Again, we're not in support of sort of an imposition on indigenous peoples without their input and decision-making authority. You have to respect the lands that you're coming into. If it's a community saying, no, we don't want that, you know, that's the obligation and the technical expertise that we were providing. As, again, we have our forest management, foresters, lumberjacks, biologists, the technicians that are doing our inventories. We're trying to bring that in-house, right? So we're driving that conversation and that initiative. I believe there are still some, again, opposition, whether it's indigenous communities or environmental justice organizations that, again, just don't support the carbon market in general. But for us, we've been able to analyze and assess for what works for us, and we're able to share that experience, whether it's Alaskan Natives, whether it's, you know, the other tribe in California, Round Valley, that's involved in the carbon market, or the other, you know, 5 tribes that are benefiting, but having an influence on how these types of programs are set up. So we encourage, again, those countries that are committed to looking at alternative finance market-based solutions, but we're also saying you have got to recognize those indigenous rights. And again, we're always open to other strategies or other tactics that seem to be working. And we do support direct action. If somebody doesn't believe something, you know, that's their right to do that. We've been there, we know that space, and we look forward to supporting those indigenous and those communities that are interested in finding up with, you know, coming up with those solutions. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, if you heard anything about the new administration's approach or ideas.
Which administration?
Some administration.
Okay, we haven't. I have not directly, but again, hopefully it goes in a positive way. I guess Trump administration is also looking at alternative ways to support indigenous peoples. Is that what you're bringing out?
Oh, no.
No, me neither. I'm just kidding. but I was hoping you knew something I didn't. But again, Brazil is a particular interesting area right now as well. In Macapá and Acre, you know, there's some administrative and political situations that, you know, we may be of assistance to, but bringing that out and raising that to an international consciousness level is very supported.
You guys might have something to say to him about his immigration status, huh?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think there is time for 1 or 2 last questions.
No questions. We've answered all the questions. No, there we go. Now we're doomed.
Another question for Javier. What's the best way? Are there ways you guys try to get your story and your voices out regarding things that people may want to know but don't, you know?
Yes, so ask tribes or environmental justice organizations directly. You know, a lot of times in the press or research projects, people, you know, and it's not only a contemporary issue, right? Theses are being written, policy briefing papers are being written about indigenous peoples or about our experience that don't include our narrative. So, you know, I spoke with 2 journalism students yesterday from the University of California, Berkeley as well. That's what we're trying to do, is change that. So the last 3 years we've had Stanford law students come up before they become the judges, before they become the Supreme Court justices or the CEOs. Here's what Yurok experience is. We just had the electrification of the last public school in California, 5th largest economy, Jack Norton, in October. And how does that happen? Is electricity a right or a privilege? And exploring those types of policy, because again, the contract's gonna be drafted whether it's a good or a service. So ask the tribe themselves, ask their analysts, ask their tribal leadership, environmental justice, again, how are those conversations being brought? We provided that space for indigenous leaders to come and strategize what their actions were going to be in San Francisco. We didn't say, this is what your action is going to be. There was a place on the Klamath River, came together, sang, prayed, ate, and discussed. And I think that's the biggest message I would say is how to tell our story is include Yuroks in telling that narrative so we can formulate those solutions coming up. Answer your question? And everybody's welcome. If you haven't been to Humboldt-Dono County and you like 3,000-year-old redwood trees, come on up.
So I was wondering if there was a possibility or room to implement perhaps some more command and control style measures on toxic air emissions and particulate matter, as opposed to, I know that the Earth Justice is not in favor of carbon markets, so could there be some, both implemented to address some of the problems that are not being addressed yet?
Absolutely, yes. And I think that this AB 617 process may well identify some of those command and control regulatory approaches that have been overlooked and are necessary. And there is a bunch of stuff in the work, a lot of things that the Air Resources Board is doing right now, especially around the freight transportation industry, a whole series of regulations that will help reduce toxic emissions, especially from diesel exhaust. You have another question on the back there. Melody's got a broken foot. She's hopping all around this whole place.
And
You guys should come to
can't
her.
help
It's a sprained ankle. It's not as bad as a broken foot.
My name is Philip Lahela Walter. I'm with the Department of Land and Natural Resources in Hawaii. And we have indigenous people over there. And unfortunately, they were not able to come here. But it is a very important issue for us. You might have heard about the struggle that the indigenous people are facing over the Mauna Kea sacred mountain over there. And at the same time, we're in the early stages of setting up a carbon market. It's not quite clear how that will look like, but I wondered what you would have to say to the Hawaiian Native people in those early stages. How, like, if you would have tips for them, how could they get themselves into the conversation, and what would be the issues that you would, or the tips that you would give them?
So we did a cultural exchange with the Kamehameha schools up in Hana as well. My son's class, again, exploring not only, I believe climate is within the curriculum. The legislature made it a curriculum requirement. Lively up yourself, I guess would be the advice and perspective that I would say. There's a lot of history of not only unoccupied areas and territories of Hawaii, but to make sure and look at the various legal recognition and the trust responsibilities regarding the landowners' issues there specifically. You have a lot of coastal hotels and motels, and again, sort of the economic infrastructure there's got to change as well. The technicians, as well as the biologists and the coastal knowledges that you have, you can't find anywhere else in the world. The economic and the ecological diversity is similar. We both have oceans and rivers. The aquifer, I would keep close tabs on that. But in regards to setting up the cap and trade or a carbon market, you want to make sure that you're included at every step of the levels that of negotiations, but governmental consultation, but again, the decision making, right? They could come and talk to your communities on all the islands. And Ni'ihau, have you been there? They've had an island that's pretty well managed, and there's a reason for that. And making sure and studying that history. But the receding beaches were of particular interest of us, so we're trying to set up that network of monitoring. So I would definitely again provide my contact information as well, because we're continuing that work and sharing information and data.
One thing I would add, I think, ensuring that there's a process where these stakeholders can participate in helping to shape what that policy ultimately looks like. Recognizing that although folks may not be trained to speak in policy language, their input is very valuable. And how do you create important that you create space where that interaction can happen. And there's ways to do it. There's, community-oriented policy advocacy work that can be done, right? Where, stakeholders in the community, from youth to elders to everybody in between, can participate in the policy in helping to vet the policy with folks classically trained to do the policy analysis. And being open to that process and resourcing that process is important. Because I think that's the one lesson that we learned in California that's kind of done as an afterthought. And it's not a functioning process, right? Because folks are trying to come here and talking to people in the community in policy jargon, and people don't understand what you're saying, right? And being able to break those things down in layman's terms, folks can give you fruitful input, and that's how folks feel they have a seat at the table in this process. And I think that's another piece that I would suggest for other folks to do.
Thank you for your great questions. And I want to thank the panel. Maybe give Joe the opportunity to just have the last word if he wants, building upon that question. Any final advice to give to other states, other places that
I don't know,
in the process California was over a decade ago?
It reminded me when we were having this whole debate over offsets, and there are these problems with trying to develop offsets that are real and permanent and surplus and quantifiable and verifiable, and especially when there's no official regulatory definition of surplus, makes it quite complicated. But I remember joking with the Air Resources Board staff who are working on this and saying that you should also make your offsets vacationable, because no one wants to go to the out in the middle of nowhere. They want to go to some place where they want a vacation. So Hawaii is a good place for that. I'm going to vacation in Hawaii this summer with my mother-in-law, who grew up in Oahu and is now 82 years old. So she's going to be telling us some really great stories about growing up there. If I can come visit you, maybe I can write the whole trip off. But offsets, obviously, in Humboldt and the Yurok tribe would be vacationable too. So it just reminded me of that. I was teasing them a bit because they were talking about setting up international offset programs that were in places that you didn't want to actually vacation. So I think you have to keep in mind that doing these programs right, if they're here, they're going to be part of this. We have to just be cognizant of the environmental justice implications of these programs, making sure that you're keeping track of it, that you're monitoring it, that you're making sure that the programs are real and being effective, that the problems in the communities aren't getting worse and they are getting better, that they're benefiting, that they're being invested in, that they're coming up with the comprehensive plans that are necessary. And in order for it to be done right.
Great. Well, thank you all again for your participation, for being here, your good questions, and for letting us go just a little bit over time. I wish you a great end of the conference, great weekend, and please join me in thanking the panelists.